In the previous video, I showed one example of what an in-text citation might look like. But there are different ways to cite something in the text, so let's have a look at those. Usually in an in-text citation, you'll need to include 2 or 3 bits of information. The first piece of information is the surname of the author or authors. If you have 1, 2, or 3 authors, you should name them all. If you have more than 3 authors, you can use the first author's surname followed by et al. That just means and the others, and it's very useful if you are running out of words for your assignment because you don't want to have to list 8 or 10 different authors. So some departments do ask you to list all of the authors in your reference list at the end. So make sure you check that for your particular department. But generally you can use et al. In the text if you have more than 3 authors. The other thing to note is that your author could be an organisation instead of a person. So in that case, you would use the organisation's name in place of the author. The second piece of information is the date that the source was published. So you just need the year, and that's always an essential part of an in-text citation. There are some circumstances where you won't be able to find a date, and we'll go through that later in the video on web pages because that is often an issue with web pages. But generally you need to include the date that the source was published. The third piece of information you only need to include if you've taken a direct quotation from that source. So you've used the exact same words in quotation marks. You should also include a page number in that case. So that's easy with a book or an article. With a web page, it's generally not needed. It just helps somebody to find those exact words more quickly. There are a couple of different ways that you might see sources cited in the text, and you can use these too. So the first way is if you haven't used the author's name in the sentence, then you would put both the author and the date, perhaps the page number, in brackets after the statement that you've made. So this example, half of 16 to 24-year-olds believe that social media has a negative impact on their well-being. And the source is a database, Mintel, and so we use the database name as the author. And you'll see that the author and the date are in brackets, separated by a comma. So again, that works with multiple authors up to 3. For 4 authors or more, use et al. As in the example here. The second way you might see it done is if the author's name has already been used in the sentence. In that case, you don't need to repeat it in the citation. It should be clear from the context. So the date goes in brackets, usually after the author's name. So here's an example where you've got the author's name and then you've got the date in brackets and then you've got the rest of the sentence. And in the second example, you've got 2 different authors cited in the same sentence, but in both cases you've used their name as part of the sentence structure, so you don't need to repeat it again in the brackets. And here's a couple of examples using a direct quotation. So going back to the example in a previous video, a recent study found that many students find referencing to be mysterious and opaque because we've used that quotation. We've included a page number in the citation. But if you use the author's names in the sentence, then you would just include the date and the page number in the brackets. So those are 2 different ways of saying exactly the same thing. Here's another question that I get asked a lot. How do you cite a source that you have seen cited in another source if you haven't read the original? So firstly, if you can, look for the original source. That way you can be sure that the second author hasn't misinterpreted it. So generally it's best to try and find the original. But there might be situations where you can't. Perhaps the book is out of print, or it's a very old journal article, or the website has disappeared. Those situations happen quite often. So there is a way that you can cite something that you haven't actually seen, and that's called secondary referencing. So a secondary citation includes the author and the date for both sources. So here's an example. The first author has been mentioned in the sentence, so their name goes outside of the brackets, but then the date of the original source goes straight afterwards inside the brackets. But then you have cited in, and you have the secondary author and the date of that book. So in this case, you've read Jansen Boyd, but you haven't read Adams. But you know that Jansen Boyd has reported this finding from Adams. The reference list should only include the source that you've read. So in this case, you would only include Jansen Boyd in the reference list and not Adams.